They say in sport you kind of die twice, and I can understand players that lose a lot of heart and lose a lot of belief. It can be a really ugly picture for a lot of players.
Matt Smith never thought he'd be a professional footballer. After university, he was applying for jobs at Accenture and Bain. Now he's one of the longest-serving championship strikers, more than 600 appearances. He's spent over a decade competing across the Football League, including 11 years in the Championship.
And I think not preparing ahead of time, getting to that point thinking, what now? I think that's where players can...
We sit down with Matt to talk about life after football. We discuss how to transition out of sport, how to build a new identity.
More of a focus of what do the next 10 years look like, because there's so much more of your life to live after the game finishes.
How he moved into the world of business and investing.
So I tried to put myself alongside people who had a track record.
And why athletes should start thinking about this long before they need to. All right, Matt, very special guest. Our first internal Sequel guest. It's great to have Star Talent working with us at Sequel to be able to interview as well. Matt was, not many people know this, but Matt was the first person I called when I had the idea for Sequel, almost 4 years ago now. And at the time, it was a Google Doc just called Project X, or Athlete Project X is what it was. And we both put a lot of notes into it. That Project X came to be called and named Sequel. And the reason we called the company Sequel is it was about the transition from, sport into the next phase of an athlete's life. Athletes have very short initial careers in professional sport, and typically they have to find something productive to do for the rest of their lives. And that was the reason we chose the name Sequel for the company. And since we started the company, Matt has transitioned from professional football to now working full-time at Sequel, which is awesome to see. So how was that transition for you from playing professional football full-time to joining Sequel?
I think in hindsight, I kind of made life a bit easier for myself by spinning my plates early. We were having those conversations. I remember that lunch really well. I was very much in London playing for Millwall at the time. Trying to think of what those next steps might look like is something I would advocate for any player kind of coming into their 30s when every year is a cherished year. And I was applying, by the time I then moved to Salford up in Manchester, I was applying so much time to Sequel, even though I was on paper part-time, I was kind of in my own mind doing it as much full-time as I could, so much so that when the transition invariably came, I retired on my own terms off the back of a great season, and I was applying that much time to Sequel that it just was second nature to when I actually officially transitioned and applied more time in my day to Sequel for all of it as opposed to a chunk of it. And it definitely made it a lot easier. I think the problem you find a lot now with players, and for me it was born a bit out of fear, was seeing how that transition can look, and it can be a really ugly picture for a lot of players. And I think not preparing ahead of time, getting to that point thinking, what now? I think that's where players can come a bit stuck, and I think giving myself those couple of years really helped me actually just kind of transition pretty seamlessly into the next phase of my life, so to speak. The sequel of my life.
You talk about some of the issues that you see with other players going through that retirement. What are they? What are some of those things that kind of created that fear?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, identity crisis is obviously one. You're used to being a footballer, an athlete in any sort of regard. So huge identity crisis of that is kind of the essence of who you are. And for me, it was me for 15 years. So kind of not being that person anymore. I can understand how people can suffer off the back of that. And then the things you read about, financial difficulties, I think can spin out a whole different load of vices, and I've seen it happen firsthand, and it does make for ugly viewing. And you said from afar, so like I said, a lot of what I did was just born purely out of fear. I don't want to be that person. I don't want to, lose my money or turn to alcohol or turn to gambling. Not that those were ever my things, but I could understand how players can go down that path because, they say in sport you kind of die twice, when you normally pass and then at the end of your career, because it's not really a normal transition. Most of my friends, certainly that I went to university with, are kind of on that upward trajectory, certainly into their mid-30s. To have to kind of start a whole thing all over again is really, really, well, it's just not common in any way, shape or form. So yeah, I can understand how it happens.
Nice. Going back to the start of your career, because we actually met originally when we were at university, and your career is highly unusual for a professional footballer. Firstly, you actually went to university before going into the professional game. Secondly, you completed an MBA whilst playing full-time as a professional footballer. Why did you invest so much in your education, and how has that had an impact on what you're doing post-football?
I think in a couple of ways. Firstly, I never thought I would have a career in professional sport. To be clear, I played university football on a Wednesday and non-league on a Saturday. I was going out 3 or 4 times a week. I didn't live the life of an athlete. I fell into it. Kind of good fortune, a bit of luck, good timing. So yeah, all those my formative years, I never thought I was destined to be a professional footballer. A lot of guys, they'll go through an academy and they'll have that upbringing and that transitions for them. Whereas for me, I was applying for management consultancy roles in London at Accenture and Bain, thinking, right, that's going to be me when I turn 21, 22. Luckily, had a really good season playing non-league, which was always just a kind of essentially a hobby of what I was doing, a bit of pocket money to go out with at uni. Ended up having a really good season. Paul Dickov gave me a pro contract at Oldham in League One, and kind of, even then, had a really bad first 18 months. Like my first steps into pro sport was terrible, and then luckily had a good back end of my time at Oldham, which then gave me the career that I've kind of since had.
Talk about that, that inflection point where your career took off at Oldham.
Yeah, like this. So I signed a 2-year deal on absolute peanuts, but I was so grateful just to have the opportunity to play in the professional game. Found the transition very hard, mentally as much as anything. I think when it's your job and it's all you think about, whereas when I was doing it in non-league, I had so many other things going on in my life, university being one, that it blends in with your other thoughts. When it's just your sole thought, I found that really difficult to deal with. And then the second half of my second season, so the last 6 months of my contract, just kind of found my feet with it. I had a really good run in the FA Cup, got a couple of goals against Liverpool, a couple of goals against Everton. That gave me some confidence that I probably lacked in the first 18 months. Ended up having really good form in the league, and it all just kind of fell into place. And then before I know it, I'm running down my contract. Oldham is saying, right, okay, stay. Whereas I'm sure pre-January they were definitely not going to extend my deal. But luckily I was a free agent in the summer, and I had probably a pick of 3 or 4 very good options to go to, and I chose to go to Leeds, which was the best decision I made at the time. But yeah, it's one of those where a lot of good luck and timing and things working, that it fell into place and worked out.
Why did you decide to do an MBA whilst playing professional football?
So that comes to that original piece of fear. Like, as much I was single for a long time in my 20s, and when I say single, I mean no kids. So I had a kind of time in the afternoons to do things, which again, when you have children at a younger age, you might not necessarily have. And I thought, right, well, I can actually apply this time to something that will benefit me once I finish. So the MBA was something I'd seen Vincent Kompany do it at Manchester University, where I'd graduated previously. I spoke to him for like an hour. He gave me an hour of his time. This is when he was playing for Man City as well. And he was like so lovely on the phone, and just kind of basically gave me an idea of what I was putting myself in for, really. And I thought it would be something that would benefit me longer term. I thought, could I see myself maybe in a director type role at a club, marry my business interests with just experience of obviously being in the arena. And then sequel kind of happened during that time, and then my mind kind of shifted from maybe working at a team to working with you and working kind of building something from scratch, really.
There's definitely some luck involved in people's career, either like good luck or bad luck. I can't believe that luck is the only thing that enabled you to become a professional footballer. In fact, I know it's not the case. So tell me some of the other things which led you on that kind of run from being a non-league footballer, studying full-time at Manchester. What are the character traits? What are the decisions that you made with your time which enabled you to end up, going on an FA Cup run, scoring against Liverpool, Everton, ultimately, ending up playing at some of the best clubs in the country?
I think obviously luck plays a part, but for me, I never had like the most natural God-given talent. Like I played with so many players that had so much more talent than me. But I think one thing I always had going for me was I was prepared to sacrifice a lot in my life, and I dedicated a lot of what I did to making sure that I was as good as I could be. So, whether that was time, doing things that other guys were doing, maybe I would step aside, whether that was towards the back end, going out as much, trying to be a bit more disciplined in that respect, and just remaining blindly enthusiastic to playing. Like I really enjoyed playing football. So, a lot of those things steered me in the right direction. Once I became a professional, I was always really curious as to how players sustained the level, or even what the next level looked like. And it became so apparent, especially when I moved to Leeds and started playing in the Championship, why players play at that level. And it's just like relentless dedication, relentless professionalism. So that's something that I always tried to maintain, whether that was coming in early, making sure my body was in good condition, recovering well, sleeping well, eating the right things. Like I'm a big believer in the 1%, and I think at that level there's such fine margins between good and great that even for me, those 1% meant that I could compete at that level, because as Championship footballers go, I'm really, really effective at a few things, which really, like, I stood out like a sore thumb for those things. But there was other things I really lacked in. But I think my dedication enabled me to sustain at that level for 11 years in the end. I played in the Championship for. So I think those things are, crucially important. I think gone are the days where you could just purely rely on talent. I think that nowadays players are just well-oiled machines that you need to be so disciplined in every other aspect. But for me, for sure, dedication and sacrifice were two things that I tried to lean on to help me.
So at Sequel, we have this thesis that storytelling helps advance mankind, right? And telling the stories of heroes are what inspires the next generation in whatever they're doing, right? Whether they're athletes, entrepreneurs, investors, is what inspires them to make that extra leap, break through, do something new. Who were your heroes as a kid?
Well, I think, I enjoyed watching Man United a lot. That was my boyhood team. I always liked it as I got a bit bigger and I kind of found myself as a tall target man. Like players like Didier Drogba were, players that I really looked up to, that I enjoyed watching. I think those types of players became more and more of a throwback as I then became a pro. So my options were a little bit limited. But, certainly my dad was huge influence on me. Like I never really had like that type of coaching guidance. Like I never came through an academy, so he was kind of always my stable guy that would always watch me. I'd always go and have a kickabout with him. Like, and when I actually think back to what he did, it's quite wild. Like as a dad now, thinking to like, so he was so positive. Like even when I played, like I think like Christ, I could come on for like 4 minutes at the end and he'd be like, you made some impact there, son, well played. And I think like, Dad, I barely touched the ball. Do you know what I mean? But
I remember that.
Yeah, he always
I remember watching in the QPR players box with him multiple times, and he was uniquely positive every single time.
Every time.
Actually, some of those performances,
average in my opinion. No, it's true. It's true. And when I think back to things, so when I, like for instance, my university days, I'd come back for long stretches of holiday, like even before that when I was 17, 18, and like he's a GP, so he would work 7 to 7 or, big chunk of hours in the day. And then like he'd take me out at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning and we'd go crossing and finishing, and then he'd do it again after work. And like I had no like real direction to play pro sport, but he would insist on helping me and doing it, even though like my path wasn't necessarily clear and obvious. When I actually think back to that now, I think, wow, it actually sounds mental that we used to do that sort of thing as like a total non-prospect, And then eventually, before I know it, I'm 22 and I am playing professional football, and still into my 30s, I'm still playing professional football. So I think back to those days and think, wow, like how incredible, to do that as a dad. So yeah, probably, and now I think probably appreciate it more being a dad, that sacrifice for him looked like, because he would then go and work from 7 to 7 and see 35, 40 patients a day. So yeah, probably that, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's like a common theme in a lot of exceptional talent in sport, and also talent that maybe came from through a non-traditional path into professional sport. If you look at the likes of Lando Norris, for example, in Formula One, his dad Adam played a massive role in helping him get there. You look at the Williams sisters in tennis, right? Their father Richard was the one who kind of shaped them and got them into a position where they were, winning every Grand Slam. So yeah, the sacrifice of parents, I think, often goes like overlooked, right?
For sure.
But it's particularly when you have that linear path into the top of a professional sport, it's critical, obviously, in shaping the path. So thanks to your dad, I guess.
Yeah, and it wasn't even like a pushy way. There was no like reinforcement for him that you have to do this, otherwise you won't get to that. It was just out of pure enjoyment for doing it with his son, I think, more than and everything that came off the back of it. Like I even say to people now, like my dad was as excited to watch me play for Solihull Moors as he was at a full house at Ellen Road. He would have got just as much satisfaction from watching me play in either game, which is quite wild, actually. And he was there for all of those, and he'd travel the most ridiculous amount of miles just to watch me play, even sometimes as a sub. But yeah, you're right. It's the sacrifice parents make totally goes overlooked.
If you you talked about your heroes back then, which you got Didier Drogba and other heroes of football. When you think about today, who are your heroes today? And they don't have to be necessarily football related.
I think once I got to probably my 30s, I then started to have a real appreciation for players who played into their 30s and 40s. Do you know what I mean? Like the likes of Ryan Giggs at Man United, or in the NFL, big NFL guy like Brady, Matthew Stafford doing it currently into his 40s, and it's like a different appreciation for longevity, because you have a totally different lens of the way sport works, and you see all these young guns coming through, and like the sense of like there's almost like a naivety about the way they go about their work, but like the guys who are still doing the same things day in, day out, those are the types of guys that I thought, wow, like you're still at peak performance at that age is wild to me. So yeah, I probably had different type of satisfaction for those kind of players.
If you could go back to, you visit your 16-year-old self in the past and give yourself 3 pieces of advice, what would they be?
If I give myself some advice, I'd say don't beat yourself up as much as you did probably in the earlier years. Kind of the biggest challenge I found mentally was not getting too high with the highs and too low with the lows. Try and stay a bit more even keel, which I managed to do a lot better as I got older. At the beginning, I was terrible at it, like particularly with the lows. I'd go mute. I wouldn't speak to anyone. I'd just become quite reclusive. So yeah, maybe don't beat yourself up so much and kind of trust the process a bit more. Just enjoy it. Like I think you get so hung up in kind of the pressures of sport that maybe you miss out on like enjoying it as much as maybe you could. Like some of the best days of your life, the dressing room environment is absolutely irreplaceable. There's no other place like it, and you just kind of learn to enjoy it. And you do, but there are times where I think where you get a bit wrapped up in kind of just the job, as opposed to sitting back and thinking, right, these are the best days ever. But I think like anything, it's hard. You do so much learning whilst playing and evolving and learning off other role models in the dressing room, and I think those are probably the things I look back on.
Okay. Your dad used positivity to kind of get you into sport. He seems to have had a relatively low pressure way of like coaching you and getting you interested. When you got into to the very top of your career in professional sport, obviously that's a very different level of pressure that you're dealing with than in non-league football. How did you handle that pressure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, like you say, there is definitely an innocence to not being in pro sport versus when you're in the pressure cooker environment. It is totally different. And like I said, at the beginning, not very well, in truth. I would mentally kind of remove myself from people if things weren't going too well, and that was something I had to deal with over time. I think dealing with pressure is ultimately what is going to separate you from success and failure. Like I've seen plenty not be able to handle it. I think certainly the managers that I've worked for have different ways of engaging with players based off how they interpret their ability to handle pressure. And I think the great ones are able to kind of almost be a chameleon in the dressing room and kind of think, right, well, he's going to react a bit differently. And I think with me, I put so much pressure on my own shoulders, and I was probably my own biggest critic, that anything external wouldn't have, eventually reached my shoulders. I was that much on my own agenda. But yeah, ultimately, how you can handle those pressure cooker environments will dictate success or failure to a degree. I think, like I said, I had good people around me, and people that if it did get, like, once I managed to deal with it a lot better, the good people around me, so much so that when games finished or I went home, that they could take my mind off it. And you kind of had friends around you go for a bit of dinner with that would just bring you back down to earth, and you remember that it's just a job at the end of the day, and there's other important things in life, such as family and friends and other things. But I think certainly, like, personal pride is such a big thing, especially for guys at the top level, that can really guide them versus just external pressure.
What was the proudest moment of your career?
I mean, obviously becoming a dad, I don't know if that counts because that was whilst I was playing. But yeah, that is probably a story into itself. But I think looking back, I'll probably be most proud that I was able to stay at a level for a long period of time. I played in the Championship for 11 years. It's probably the one thing, coming from where I've came from with no real footballing background in the true sense, to be able to get into the game late at 22 and stay in the second division for that length of time is probably the one thing I look back and say, be proud about. Playing for clubs like Leeds and Fulham, even QPR, Millwall, they're all massive clubs in their own right. But those are things that I'll look back fondly of. And then, like I said, the kind of last chapter of being a dad, my son watching me play, kind of probably full circle moment from everything at the beginning. So yeah, I wouldn't say any one particular moment, but I look back with a sense of pride. And I don't think it's until you finish that you begin to become nostalgic and look back. Like, I never reflected much when I was playing. You would just focus on the next thing and the next more and trying to be better and all the rest of it. So yeah, definitely look back with pride of what I achieved. Would have loved to have played in the Premier League. That was the one thing that I probably regretted, not have quite making the next step. If I could have had a couple of appearances in the Premier League, that probably would have been the icing on the cake. But no, I definitely can't look back with any regrets.
Yeah, look, you've obviously transferred now from professional sport into business, right? And it was a pretty fast transition with some overlap. What are the skills that have helped you from your career in sport, which have been transferable into the world of business?
I think there's loads of stuff that's really transferable. I think communication probably is one. I think, the way we communicate in sport is so direct, it's so quick, it's in high pressure environments, instant. I think that's ultimately how you live or die in sport, is your ability to communicate with teammates. So I think there's a lot of crossover with that in a business environment and with your team. Yeah, like I said, being able to handle pressures that will come in the business world. I've experienced plenty of them already. But yeah, teamwork, being able to collaborate, all of those things that lend itself well to a business environment. I think there's, like I said, there is that part to it, but then for me is obviously there's so much that's totally foreign and totally new to me. I think the business world just seems a bit bigger. I think there's that many people that operate in the business space whereas pro sport feels very small. Like, I'm playing the same people every single season, year in, year out. Like, I must have, come up against them 4, 5, 6 times in my career, and you're seeing the same teams, the same faces. It feels cliquey, it feels small, whereas when you kind of enter this world, you're constantly meeting people from all over the world in different fields. It feels extremely vast, and that probably can seem a little bit overwhelming at times. I'd probably say that's what feels largely different. I know the sports ecosystem within business will be small, the tech ecosystem will be small, VC is its own world, but I think it feels a lot more of a bubble inside the world of pro sport maybe than it does kind of in this larger business landscape.
Okay. Going back to something you said earlier, we talked about how you got ahead of your transition by, starting to work and starting to invest your time whilst you were still playing football in doing an MBA and doing a little bit of work with SQL and doing some investing. There's a lot of people out there who publicly try and discourage professional athletes from doing that, right? And say they should focus all of their time on playing and on being the best athlete they can be. What do you think about that?
The essence of it, I can understand kind of the root of where they're coming from is your focus should be on your sport, which is totally true. My focus was always on football, fundamentally. I just think as someone who lived that world for such a long time, you do have so much spare time. I was home from training at like 2 o'clock every day, and I'm going to rest and recover and put my feet up and eat the right things. But,
yeah, there's this concept, like, I get people saying to me all the time, oh, well, athletes are so busy, it's really hard to get. I'm like, they're not really. They've got some time, right? They have to.
For sure.
Lots of people want their time, but they choose how to spend it at the end of the day.
No, absolutely. And listen, at the top level, when you're playing European competitions and you're traveling a lot, I can understand. But again, when you're traveling, you do have a lot of spare time. You're in hotels a lot of the time, with hours to yourself if you want it. I get a couple of different sports, baseball in particular, they play 168 games a season. It's a little bit different, but I think the notion of they have no spare time is a little bit of a myth. And I chose off my own back, and I know a lot of players that do, to invest that time in a productive way. So for me, a lot of reading, podcasts, trying to meet people. Obviously, like, I was kind of living on my own in London, so I chose to meet people, be it in the founder space, in the VC space, and just apply it to stuff that I thought would benefit me longer term. So I would always be an advocate for use your time wisely. Don't waste it. And listen, I spent my time in coffee shops, and I lived a mile from Harrods, so I spent the odd time going around Harrods, but it would be ultimately a big waste of your time if that's all you ended up doing. So I kind of think I always try to say to players, like, if you can apply it to something that will benefit you longer term, you can stand you in great stead.
I think people also underestimate. People are really happy to give you time and help you and give you advice, and they're actually much more willing to do that whilst you're still playing, funnily enough.
100%, right? Yeah.
And I think, you've got examples of people who gave you time, right, while you were still a player in the world of VC.
Yeah.
You've got Harry Stebbings, who, I think reached out to you over Twitter. and was willing to go and, have a walk with you, talk to you about the fundamentals of investing. Taking advantage of that whilst you're a player is really critical, because sometimes after you retire, those people are less willing or
100%.
seem to be less able to spend that time with you.
Totally agree. I think I say to players all the time, especially a lot of our guys, in the Premier League or in the NFL and the NBA, is like, though, just by proxy, you being in those, having that status, people will naturally say yes to anything. If you want a conversation with them, you want a coffee with them, you want to pick their brains. It carries a level of status that enables you to have conversations that you might not necessarily have otherwise. Like I said, Harry Stebbings is a great example, like someone I really looked up to. He was probably my first, outside of yourself, my first kind of foray into venture was listening to his podcast, To and From Training every day. And then I followed him on Twitter. He messaged me saying, do you fancy meeting up for a coffee? Those are types of things that probably just normally wouldn't happen, but can happen just by being immersed in that world. He happened to be a Fulham fan and lived, half a mile away from my house. So I always encourage guys to be proactive, ask questions. I think some people can be a little bit shy or might not want to extend themselves to us, even though they might deep down want to. But I always think that, people are out to help you. They want to help you, and particularly when you're in that world, to try and take advantage of it, because like you say, your time is precious, your time is definitely limited, and then I kind of know from being on the other side of the curtain now, it's not to say that those types of things don't happen anymore, but for sure I feel like there's an element of prestige when you're active and in that division or in that league.
Yeah, for sure. I talk a lot about how like being a founder is similar to being a professional athlete, in that, you know, there are lots of ups and downs on a founder journey, and you can't hide from any of them. Like, you have to like embrace the tough times. You have to take lessons from them. As a footballer, there's no hiding if you have a bad game, right? Like, everyone knows, and you have to face it. What are some of the most challenging points in your career in sport, and how did you overcome them?
I think the most challenging is something that I've experienced a lot, which is like just generally being out of favour with a manager. So the way I played as a player is unique. I could be a little bit Marmite. Some managers loved having my style of play in the team. Some, it just wasn't for them at all. So trying to like battle against managers where my style wasn't necessarily their cup of tea, I had some hard times with that, you know. So definitely just like trying to stick with the process, trying to stay professional when you're not getting picked, when you're out of the team, going week to week without really getting many minutes. Those are the hardest times as a player, and you can either go one of two ways. Like, I can see players now being super professional, doubling down on everything they're doing, and I think that will pay dividends long term, or go the other way and be less professional, moody, less responsive, can be a bit of a rotten apple in the dressing room, just, you know, have a disregard for their craft. Like, so I can see it go both ways, really. For me, I always tried to double down and tried to stay positive. And I think long term, you know, because if I look back, a lot of my appearances, like you mentioned, 600 games, a lot of those appearances were from the bench, you know. But I think having the mindset to not get discouraged, to remain professional, is really hard, because ultimately your reward as a player, you train Monday to Friday, your reward is to play on a Saturday, and when you don't get that, it can be really, really discouraging. I can understand players that lose a lot of heart and lose a lot of belief just by being an unused sub or not even making the squad. So for me, I think my ability to make that milestone of 600 something games was because I never kind of lost faith and just kind of doubled down on my principles and, you know, trained hard. And I think that certainly the hardest time as a sportsman, for sure, and something I faced a lot in my career with different managers. So I'd probably say the ability to tackle that was something that will stand any player in good stead.
Nice. Were there any like inflection points in your career where you had to learn a really tough lesson and that changed the trajectory of your career, or kept it going on an upward trajectory?
I think I was quite fortunate in the sense that my career was kind of an upward swing for the majority of it, and then I think age naturally came into effect. I remember being at Millwall, and I'd kind of had relatively similar earnings my whole career, and then I came into my third season at Millwall, and I got a phone call to say, you know, your wages are going to be slashed, I think more than 50%. And I think that was the first time that I thought, okay, right, it's not just like that, you know, and it's going to plateau and come down. I think that was a bit of like, okay, wow, getting a bit older now, this is what we're dealing with now. And I think at that point it made me kind of value football a little bit more and kind of understand that, the advice that you get given every year is a cherish year post 30 for me was that probably reinforced that more than anything. And then it's not to say for any reason that it made me work hard or anything like that. It didn't, because I always kind of maintained the same, held myself to the same standard. But I think it was probably that moment where I thought, right, okay, start to think a little bit more about what the next aspect of your life might look like. That's when the MBA came into the equation. I started having those thoughts. That's when, not long after, we probably met about sequel and what Project X, let's call it at the time, and started to have those thoughts and started to ideate, and that made me excited and to think, okay, right, because you do start to think maybe like 10 years ahead. Like once you get to that stage of your career, you're thinking, right, what's the next 10 months look like? What's the next 10 months looks like from, you know, July through to May. But I think you need to then have more of a focus of what do the next 10 years look like, because there's so much more of your life to live after the game finishes, you know. So that, I wouldn't say that was necessarily a failure, but it was just the realization that there's an end date to this, and that was probably the first time when I was at Millwall, I thought, okay, wow, this is the first time when it's not just kept going like that, or like, you know, that sort of graph that you see upward trajectory. But yeah, and then other failures, like, you know, I remember at QPR, Mark Warburton, who was a manager, he took over, and I remember he had 7 meetings with me in 6 days about leaving before I'd even kicked a ball under him. So it was just off the back of Steve McLaren leaving. He came in, obviously just wanted to wipe the slate clean and have a few players, needed to make way for the style of players that he wanted to bring in. I remember thinking, wow, you've not even seen me, like, I've not kicked a ball for you yet. Do you know what I mean? We've had 7 meetings in the first week, and there's only 6 days, so we had 2 on one day. Do you know what I mean? It was all kind of orchestrated around my future, not, you know, and I respect his honesty, but I think that was another, like, okay, like, that was one of the more ruthless experiences I had. And you know what, that meant I went to Millwall, really enjoyed my time there, like, loved the club, so ultimately became a positive thing. But I think different moments in your career where they're lessons, but shape you up for a better thing if you go about it in the right way, maybe.
You talked about being a father being your proudest moment. How does that change your own decision making on a day-to-day basis? Did that impact how you potentially want to develop your career? Did it impact your goals outside of sport? What did becoming a father change for you?
I think it gave me, like, a broader perspective on life and what's important. You know, I think I was so consumed in football and that being everything, but I think, like, the broader family piece of having children just naturally changes your perspective. And however good or bad or indifferent your day is, you come home, you see your son, in my case, you know, just changes. Nothing can be better than that experience, you know. So for me, it was more of a comfort blanket to think that regardless of the ups or downs, it probably just kept me constant, being able to go home and be with him. So definitely changes a lot of perspective. And I think now, in the next phase of my life, it's probably more about, you know, yes, still having that, but also just sharpens your intuition to make you want to succeed and be able to give him, you know, a life that you would want him to have, and all the opportunities that maybe you experienced, and more. It definitely, I think, because I came to fatherhood probably later than most, you know, in my mid-30s, changed my perspective for sure.
In terms of Lennon and you know, his future, how do you take some of the lessons from how your dad brought you up, what you've experienced in your life, and how do you take that and kind of, what are the kind of principles that you're going to take and bring to Lennon and any other kids you have in the future to help give them the best chance in life?
I think just being really present, really enthusiastic, doing everything with him, you know, being positive, you know, guiding him in the right way. You know, I think the thing, he was just always there, he was always available, you know. I think as a kid you probably take it for granted, just, you know, you don't quite understand what goes on behind the scenes, you just think, oh, he's there. But I think for me, you know, being super present, being really hands-on, anything that he likes or loves, channeling that enthusiasm in a good way, be a healthy role model, like all the things that I was lucky enough to have with my parents, you know, to be that for them, you know. So I definitely think, you know, he's only nearly 4, so he's very young, but you know, for me, just being a dad in general is to try to live by those principles, that, you know, being really hands-on, being present, and like I said, and then when you do find yourself in a work environment, giving everything you can to being a success, to try and give them the life that you hope that they can live.
Nice. So you're the first person I called when we had the idea for sequel. Back then it was just called Project X, and we had a Google Doc that we dumped, you know, thousands of words of research and ideas into. You know, you brought something very different to that document when I go back and read it. Tell us more about, like, what was your driving sort of motivation behind getting involved with sequel back then? And what did what was particularly important for you in that initial mission that we had when we started the business?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the big thing for me coming off the back of, I remember the original lunch that we had, was just what a valuable proposition it would be. You know, I've kind of been in the VC space for a number of years, 7 or 8 years by that point, and I kind of understood how access was everything. So, you know, what you were suggesting kind of as a value proposition to players, I understood how incredible it was and how unique it was, that I thought players have to be able to have this. You know, being able to democratize elite tier access to everyone is something that, you know, is so rare that, you know, usually that type of quality of deal, let's say, is reserved for a very elite type of player. And, you know, being able to provide that to, you know, I was never a star player by any means. I was very much a mid-tier player, but who'd networked and, you know, grafted to try and get the deal flow that he did. But to be able to have, be in those types of rooms, those types of circles, was something that I thought every player should have access to. And then in terms of the ideation phase, it was more a case of like, right, how can we make players really understand, really digest, really learn this stuff, you know, because how do we present it in a way that will have some meaning to them and they'll be a bit more empowered and, you know, they can begin to execute decisions on their own accord, albeit in a highly controlled, highly filtered way. So kind of looking down that lens was something that I was kind of focused on, I think, when we were developing the idea. Like, short form video was something that I said explicitly from day one. You know, written content, I think, yes, we need it, but it has to be supplemented by video. It has to be supplemented by like clear messaging, you know, breaking down jargon, you know, making things kind of easy to grasp, I think was a big thing. I think just the whole idea of it just really excited me, and I think that's what my takeaway from that time was. I was really excited by the prospect because it was kind of marrying up a lot of things I was already doing, but funneling it in a more elite, professional way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, look, you speak to hundreds of athletes now who are, you know, currently playing, but they're thinking ahead to what comes next after their career in professional sport. What's one piece of advice you give to athletes who are thinking about what might come next?
I mean, listen, always spin your plates early. That's the one thing I always say is like try and prepare ahead of time. Try and think about what's next long before that day comes. I think that will make the transition easier. It'll still be hard, but it'll make it easier. Having that sense of purpose. I think that's the big thing for players is purpose, like having something to get up and go in the morning for and that they actually enjoy doing. So I don't think you're necessarily going to figure that out whilst you're playing. You might have an idea of what that might look like, but I think just putting the wheels in motion so it softens the transition, because it is hard whichever way it comes about. And then like I always encourage, and this sounds a bit strange to say, but like to try and be the dumbest guy in the room when it comes to different interests you might have. Like for me that was a big thing, like try and be in rooms that make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And for me, obviously I had a vested interest in other things going away from the field, so I tried to put myself alongside people or piggyback off people who had a track record, who had experience of success. I'm always a big believer to a degree that historical performance is a reasonable indicator of future performance. So I always carried that with my kind of investing journey and in venture especially. And that's kind of almost the message that I try and give to players. You know, the sequel, for instance, is you're going to be in rooms with people who have incredible track record, incredible success, you know, that you're not otherwise going to be able to access. And it's something that I always try to encourage players is try and get in those rooms, as opposed to being the big fish in the small pond. Try and just go the other way with it, and I think naturally you'll find a half decent path.
Nice, awesome.